Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. I'm not sure what's going on up here. I got creative on the airplane with PowerPoint. This is where I work. I work in a nightclub that's surrounded by lava. I'm coming to you from Washington University in St. Louis, and my name is Andy Butler. And today I'm going to be talking about facilitating student learning through feedback. Let me zoom out for a second, though, and just riff a little bit on kind of my general approach, because it's going to be evident today, I think, as I go through here. A lot of what we do in education when we intervene are these large-scale interventions. We wholesale replace pedagogy. We revamp curricula. A lot of these interventions that we do are very resource-intensive, and my approach is a little bit different, because I think that a lot of what we do in education is going pretty well. I mean, we could do things better, right? And sometimes you need these whole-scale interventions. But we could also think about taking existing educational practices and thinking about how to soup them up. And that's kind of my approach. So really what I'm interested in a lot of my work is applying simple but powerful principles from the science of learning to improve educational practice. And this has a lot of advantages. First is these principles are generalizable to lots of different types of learners, lots of different domains. They're very easy to implement and can be flexibly implemented within lots of different contexts. They scale. They're very cost effective. And finally, they're useful for both teachers and students. These are things that students can use outside of the classroom. So what are these principles? Well, here is kind of a smattering of them. These are things like retrieval practice and spacing and interleaving, variability, and today I'm going to be talking about feedback. So this is not an exhaustive list, and I'll actually weave in some of these other principles as we go along today. Why am I talking about feedback? Well, feedback is really important. So I don't know if you all are familiar with this book, Visible Learning by John Hattie. But if you aren't, I really recommend it. It's great. It's a kind of a view on high from all the research that has been done in education about student achievement and the factors that lead to it. The reviewer up there that's on the front says it reveals teaching's holy grail, which I think might be a little bit strong, but there's really good stuff in here. And when you look in this book, one of the most powerful factors that affects student achievement is feedback. And here I'm kind of just summarizing what's in there. Over 1,200 studies done on feedback and student achievement that featured over 67,000 students, over 2,000 effects going into this, average effect size of 0.73. This is one of the most powerful factors that affect student learning. When we think about feedback, we can think about, this is a very big and broad thing. So feedback can be directed at the self. So it can be telling the learner, praising the learner, or disparaging the learner, right? And this is kind of a controversial aspect of feedback that's not always effective. Feedback can be given on self-regulation, so students' metacognition, their ability to manage time, et cetera. Feedback can be directed at the process, so how a student is approaching a problem or an activity. And finally, what I'm going to focus on a bit more today is this task-level feedback. And this is about when students perform in doing any kind of activity or task on a test. This is feedback about their performance in that situation. And when we think about task feedback, a lot of times what we do when we summarize performance is we kind of look at just, how many correct, how many incorrect did a student get, right? Or just kind of overall accuracy. One of the things that I've been very interested in is kind of drilling down on errors and trying to understand student errors and the etiology of these errors, right? Because not all errors are created equally, right? They have different causes. And here are some possible causes of errors, right? A student may have the requisite knowledge but may fail to express it in that situation, right? They may make a calculation error or something. They may slip or fail to retrieve knowledge in that situation. They may have knowledge but fail to be able to apply it. They may completely lack knowledge or correctly guess. And finally, they might have a misconception. And I'll get a little bit more into that later on. But clearly, all these things are a bit different, right? And when you're thinking about remediating learning, right, remediating errors, you might treat these things differently in what you do. And good teachers can recognize this, right? But even good teachers are really overloaded. And so one of the things I'm interested in is trying to figure out how we can use technology to identify and categorize and figure out how to optimally remediate these things. So I don't have time to talk about all this stuff. What I chose is 3 things to focus on today. And what I want to do is evaluate those things, or tell you about those things through kind of the lens of evaluating conventional wisdom. Okay, I've got 3 pieces of conventional wisdom that I think are, you know, and you can argue with me, I'd be happy to be argued with, pretty widely accepted within education. Here they are. Feedback should be given as soon as possible. Knowledge, when a student has knowledge, right, it can prevent them from acquiring a misconception. And finally, misconceptions are extremely difficult to correct. So we're going to go through these and kind of evaluate, you know, what we think about them. Yeah? You ready? People are awake? Joe did it to me here with giving me the post-lunch talk and then also do an Indian buffet, which just exponentially increases the possibility that you all are going to fall asleep. All right. So here's the first one. Feedback should be given as soon as possible. How many people, raise your hands, how many people agree with this? Okay. How many people have heard this, right? This is a lot of places. In education, right, this is very much the mantra. We produce a lot of technology, and this is some technology going back a century, in order that is devised for the sole purpose, or, well, one main primary purpose of these things is to give immediate feedback to students. We have teaching machines from the early 1900s all the way to you know, complex systems that deliver immediate feedback, and other devices like clickers, right? The goal is to get students feedback as quickly as possible. Now, where do we get that idea from? Does anybody know? Here's a quote. In many cases, for example, when papers are taken home to be corrected, as much as 24 hours may intervene. It is surprising that this system has any effect whatsoever. Who said that? Nobody. It's our friend B.F. Skinner. Here he is with his pigeon. Now, this line of thinking, right, immediate feedback is better, it comes directly from behaviorism. And I respect behaviorism. Behaviorism is great. I'm not trying to denigrate behaviorism. But we have a problem when we are conflating feedback, which has an informational quality, with reinforcement. Reinforcement works extremely well in humans and animals. Reinforcement needs to be given immediately. If I'm talking to my dog and I say, hey, remember when you sat last week? Here's a bone for that. My dog's going to be like, thank you. I don't know what that was for, but I appreciate it. Students are different. Students have the ability to mentally time travel back, right? I can say, hey, remember this activity you did last week? Here's some feedback on that. They can recreate the scenario. So let's reevaluate this idea that immediate feedback is always the best way to go. So I'm going to tell you about a laboratory study. I'm going to tell you about some laboratory research today, some classroom research. Here's a laboratory study we did to just kind of look at this. We had students come in, and they studied passages about a number of topics. And then they took a multiple choice test that was about information in those passages. This is mostly factual stuff. After the multiple choice test, they got feedback either immediately after each question or 1 day later. Okay? So we're manipulating the timing of the feedback. A week later, they come back and they get a short answer test. They get basically the same stems from the multiple choice test, but they have to produce the information themselves. Okay? Let's see what happens. Here's the data. I'm plotting the proportion correct on that final short answer test. And what you can see here is delaying feedback a day didn't hinder performance. It actually benefited students in terms of their retention on this week-long delayed short answer test. And what was interesting was that this benefit of delaying feedback was present both for information that they had made a previous error for, right, an incorrect response, but also their correct responses. So here's some evidence, right, that would say, oh, delaying feedback may not be so bad. It might actually be helpful. And when we start to wonder why, there's one obvious explanation. So what I think is that this is really a spacing effect, in a sense, right? So spacing effects are the finding that given the equivalent amount of time, spacing out practice leads to better long-term retention, deeper understanding than massing practice, right, or massing study. And so here's a little schematic that depicts that, right? If you're trying to learn A, doing a little A, then more A later on, rather than doing cramming all together. Cramming does produce good benefits right afterwards, right? But in the long run, it's really doesn't work very well. So we've demonstrated this a number of times in the laboratory. Other labs have replicated this same finding. But you can wonder, right, okay, this is great, it's a laboratory, these are facts. What about the classroom? So let's think about this, right? We got the laboratory, we got the classroom. This is an actual picture of my laboratory. It's very fancy. No, it's not. Laboratory is different than the classroom, right? I'm controlling a lot of things in this laboratory study that may not be controllable in the classroom. I mean, for one, in the classroom, there's a lot of noise. But in addition, I can control the processing of feedback, right, to ensure every student who is in that laboratory study process the feedback, right? And I can require them to process it for every single item, right, even the correct items. That may not be the case in the classroom. So let's move to the classroom. I'm going to show you a classroom study because we said, well, let's go see if this works. Here's a classroom study that we conducted at UT El Paso. This is in an engineering course. This is a core course in that major. And it's a signals and systems course. It's quite complex materials. I'm going to give you a flavor of what these complex materials are in a second, so hold on to that idea. And what we did with this course is we didn't touch anything about the course except for the homeworks. The students in this course did weekly homeworks, okay? And all we did was we went in and we manipulated whether feedback on that homework was given immediately after they turned it in or a week later. And this is a within student design, so what we had is in every given week, right, half the students are getting immediate feedback, half are getting delayed feedback, and then it swaps the next week, right? So everybody benefits if one of these two conditions is better. And what we did was then compare performance on the final exam and breaking it down, right, whether those concepts had been ones that on homeworks had received immediate feedback or delayed feedback. So let me show you these materials, right, because before we were using kind of basic factual stuff in a passage. These materials are a little bit more complex. And what I want to do is I want to offer anybody, right, you get the answer to this question, I'll show you a sample question. Joe's going to give you a free registration to EdCog next year, yeah. So here we go, ready? Don't shout it out, here we go. Raise your hand if you got it. No. Duh, right? You knew that. Okay, I know. If I had given you more time, you would have had it. I have no idea what this means. So this is why you collaborate with people who are domain experts in other areas, right? So this is the kind of work that they're doing on these homeworks, right? This is complex stuff. And when they get it a week later, right, they're re-given the context. And the way that we're doing this is we're using technology to deliver this homework and deliver the feedback. And just as a quick aside, we were using this personalized learning system that I had worked on with folks at Rice. These are engineers, machine learning engineers. This is a very neat project, and OpenStax is a larger open education project that I can talk more about at the end if you'd like. But is a really neat tool and free and open to people to use. So technology helps you to automate some of this stuff, right? So if you were going to delay feedback or implement any of these principles, technology makes it better. So let's look at exam performance at the end of the course, okay? Students have gone along, they've done homeworks, immediate delayed feedback, etc. Here's what you see. Even in this noisy, messy environment, right, delaying feedback here had a benefit for students. Now what I'm showing you here is a condition where we required students to view the feedback, okay? But we also, I didn't depict it here, but we had another manipulation in a second study where we had one section have the option to study feedback or not. They could decide whether to do that themselves. It was optional. In the other section, it was required. You see the same benefit regardless of whether you require or do not require the viewing of feedback in the course. The magnitude of the effect is smaller because guess what happens when you don't require students to view feedback? They don't do it. They view it about half the time. It's really depressing, right? If feedback has such an important effect on learning, this 0.73 effect size according to Hattie, right? Maybe we should think about requiring them to process it, right? I know a lot of us have given back exams and had students go thank you and then never looked at it. And you're like, why did I write all the things that I wrote? One interesting thing in this is that we asked students about their experience in the course. And here's what we asked them. Did you prefer getting feedback immediately or after a delay? What do people think they said? Immediately, right? Okay, but this is asking them about their preferences, right? They prefer immediate gratification, et cetera. That's okay. We also ask them about, in terms of your performance in the course, okay? Put aside your preference. In terms of your performance in the course, which do you think helped you more, immediate or delayed feedback? Immediate feedback was the overwhelming response. So this is a nice example of this metacognitive disconnect that exists with a lot of these principles that I'm talking about, right? I was talking about earlier. The benefits of these principles are not things that are readily apparent to students, right? So implementing them can be kind of difficult because students don't necessarily recognize that they're benefiting from what they're doing. Oftentimes because they're a little bit more difficult to engage with, right? And which is what causes a lot of this learning. So let me quickly recap here this first bit, right? I'm not trying to say that immediate feedback should never be given. That's silly. There are lots of times in learning when immediate feedback is necessary, particularly if students are going to go on learning about the same thing in the near future, right? There's no need to have a student struggling, right? Give them feedback. However, if that activity or material or other things are going to be put aside for a bit, and that does happen a lot in education, right? Delaying feedback a little bit may actually be beneficial for students. And in general, I think when you're, in terms of practical considerations, figuring out when to do this, base it on, what's practical for you, right? If you don't have technology, then to give immediate feedback, then maybe delaying feedback will be okay. And when students come to you and complain, oh, you took a week to grade the exams, you can say, you're welcome. I'm helping you. So let's move on to number 2 here. This is this idea that having knowledge, right? If students have knowledge, it's going to prevent them from acquiring misconceptions, right? I'm talking about knowledge that directly contradicts the kind of misinformation that they might encounter, right? This seems pretty intuitive. We have a lot of knowledge. Everybody in this room, right? You have schemas, you have scripts, you have semantic networks, all these things that tell you about the way the world works around you. And a lot of this is accurate. The vast majority of it is accurate. But we also have false knowledge. And this false knowledge can be either conflicting, right? This is something that directly contradicts the way that the world works. It could be additive in the sense that it kind of embellishes or elaborates on accurate information, but it's still not true. And when we think about students going around the world acquiring misconceptions, right, they can do so from a lot of different sources. So here are just a few of them, right? We get misconceptions from personal experience. So there are things like our sense of how gravity works and force works, right? And we have one experience, but that's actually kind of counter to the way that these things actually work. We can make incorrect inferences. We have certain misconceptions that develop and then disappear over the course of cognitive development. We get these things from other people. It's a big source. And we also get this from popular culture, which is kind of other people, right? But not directly from them. And this last one is one that I've been particularly interested in. So I've been really interested in fiction and learning from fiction. So here are a bunch of fictional materials. We've got books, we've got movies, we've got video games, which now really have these amazing narrative forms. We got plays, we got all kinds of things, right? And one of the interesting things about fiction, right, is that, some fiction is like way far out, okay? But a lot of it is based in reality and blends reality with fantasy. Now, fiction has been used in education for a long, long time and used for many reasons. So if we go back to ancient Greece, right, we have poems like the Iliad that people use, which blend fantasy and reality to try to teach people things like morals. In modern day, we use these things all the time as well, right? We use them to create student interest, teach them course content, all kinds of things, even to teach critical thinking, and I'll come back to that in a second. So one issue with doing this, right? There are lots of great reasons to use fiction. One issue with doing this is that sometimes creators of fiction take liberty with the facts. And sometimes these are little things, right, that aren't really particularly important, but sometimes these are big things. So here's an example. Who here has seen Amadeus? Anyone? Okay. So Amadeus is it was first a Broadway play, but then, or maybe it was a musical, but then it was a movie. And this was in the early 80s. Before the play and the movie, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was, a fairly well-known musician, but didn't enjoy the popularity that he does now. After these, there was this, what was called Mozart mania in the 80s, where everyone was super into Mozart. When you look at the movie, what's interesting about the movie is that the portrayal of Mozart in the movie is one that characterizes him as being very silly and flamboyant and arrogant and disrespectful. And when you look at the historical record, that's actually kind of antithetical to the way he was. I mean, he probably had a healthy ego, because it's pretty awesome, right? But he was very respectful of other people, and so these things don't match. So what we wanted to do is do some research to look at, what happens to students when they watch these kind of films, or we've also done other research with reading fictional novels. What happens? Do people pick up these misconceptions, or are they able to keep fiction separate from reality, right? You could say, oh, this is a fictional piece of material, I'm not gonna acquire that, right, and mix it in with my knowledge of how the world works. And we wanted to do so with looking at whether students had the requisite knowledge they needed to combat, right, directly contradict that misinformation. So here's what we did. We created a laboratory paradigm where we had people come in and they studied texts about historical topics, and then they watched related film clips, okay? And they were told in this study, come on in, see these things, we want you to learn the information in the text. We're going to show you some clips that kind of illustrate the material, right? But your job in this study is to learn what's in the text. Critically, the text contained only true information, okay? And that true information directly contradicted a large piece of misinformation in each of these film clips. And before watching each of the film clips, we had three different conditions here. We had a condition where they got a specific warning, said, here is that exact piece of misinformation in the film clip. We had a general warning that said just kind of like, these are fictional materials, watch out. And then we had a condition where we had no warning. So just read the text, watch the film. Here are the stimuli we used. So we used a bunch of different films here. To give you another example, we have the movie U-571. Have people seen that one? So this is a movie about U.S. sailors who capture a German U-boat and recover a Nazi Enigma machine that helps them crack the code and turn the tide in World War II. The funny thing is, it was actually the British that did that. So when this movie was released in the UK, guess what happened? British people were pretty pissed, and rightly so, right? So, this is a major thing in the movie, and you can imagine if you go around your life and you see a bunch of movies like this that portray the U.S., doing all these things to win World War II, it may actually skew your sense of history, of the U.S.'s role in winning that war, right? So there are implications here. So we used a bunch of different clips, a bunch of different texts here, all related. Here's what happened. What I'm showing you here is when we gave them a test a week later, we asked them, we're not asking about the film clips, we're asking about the text that you read, and gave them questions that probed, right, the correct information in the text that directly contradicted what was in the film. So they could say one or the other, or they could say something else, right? What happened was, viewing those film clips led to the acquisition of misinformation, right? There was actually another condition, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you about, where we just gave them the text only, right? No film. And what happened was, when they saw the film, they tended to misremember that information from the film. The general warnings that we gave people were completely ineffective, right? Didn't do a lick of good. And what was interesting was that when you asked the people who participated in this experiment, where did you get this information from in this answer? Did you get it from the text or the film? A lot of times they often said the film, but they said this was also in the text. So they're misattributing, right? This is another metacognitive error. They're misattributing, right, that misinformation to being in the vertical text, even though it wasn't. So one of the things that we wanted to do was try to figure out, can we keep this from happening through other means? And one of the things you oftentimes see teachers doing with fictional materials is using them to teach critical thinking. A history class might teach about a historical event and then have students critique a film about its historical accuracy, right? How can you critically think about what's going on in this film and critique it? So we had this study where we tried to mimic this learning activity. We asked people to detect the misinformation in the movies. And here's what we did. We had the same kind of paradigm, right? They're reading the text, watching the films. They always read the text first, and then we had 3 groups. One group was this control condition that got no instructions, so they're kind of like what you saw before. We had 2 other conditions in which people were trying to detect the misinformation in the films. One of them were just trying to detect, and then they got no feedback about whether they'd been successful or not. The other group got feedback, okay? They tried to detect it. They said, what was the misinformation? They said what they thought it was, and then we told them what it was actually, right? Oh, you're right, or actually it was this. And then we looked at, how did they do on this memory test that we give them later on for the information in the text? Did this detection task improve their performance? So again, I'm showing you the misinformation that they produced on that subsequent test. And what you can see is detection did not help at all. Just that task of trying to detect the misinformation was no better than not doing it, right? When they got feedback after the detection task, that helped a lot, right? It really significantly reduced the likelihood that they were going to acquire that misconception. And here's why that happened. So students were very poor at this task. Only about 35% of the time did they detect the misinformation in the film, despite the fact that it is blatant, right? And it was directly contradicted in the text that they had read immediately before. And even when it was detected, what was really interesting is sometimes they went on to reproduce that misinformation anyway. Right? They'd found it, but they weren't sure of it. And this generally happened when they didn't get feedback. Right? They thought they had it, maybe they weren't sure, they reproduced it later on. So what you can see here is what I'm plotting is the proportion of misinformation as a function of the detection condition, either detection or detection with feedback, and whether or not they detected it or not. And what you can see is even if they successfully detected it, right, they went on to produce it sometimes. It's really the feedback that they're getting later on that is critical to reducing the probability that they're going to acquire a misconception from watching the films. So why does this happen? Well, really this is about what my colleague Beth Marsh likes to call knowledge neglect. There's this idea that in a lot of situations we may have relevant knowledge that we could bring to bear, but we oftentimes neglect it, right? We don't actually bring it to mind. And people oftentimes fail to notice inaccurate information as they process information, even if it does directly contradict their knowledge, right? So here's a question for you. Ready? How many animals of each type did Moses take on the ark? Moses didn't take any animals on the ark, right? It was Noah. There are things like this, right? You all know that Noah took the animals on the ark, or many of you do, presumably, right? But you process that question very fluently and you produce an answer. What's interesting here is that warnings and instructions to monitor, et cetera, right, trying to make these things more salient to people as they go through doesn't help. What does help is getting feedback afterwards, right? When we think about why this happens, there are probably a lot of reasons why knowledge neglect occurs. For one, people have a bias to assume that things are true, right? A lot of what we encounter in the world is true, right? So we're kind of biased to assume truth. But also it's that we fluently process information even if it is inaccurate, if it's surrounded by other accurate information, right? We kind of gloss over it. So let me recap here. Learning from fictional materials can have a lot of benefits for students, right? I'm not saying don't use these things, but we got to be careful because students can also acquire misconceptions, especially when there are big ones in these films or novels or other things that we're giving to students. We have to remember that they're really poor at detecting these. We all are. And it's pretty hard to train people to be better at it. Asking students to detect it is probably not the solution. I mean, that could be a useful exercise potentially, but you got to make sure that you give them feedback afterwards so that they don't come away with misconceptions. Okay, last one. Misconceptions are extremely difficult to correct. What do you guys think? Raise your hands if yes. Raise your hands if no. Easy to correct. Not a big deal, right? Well, let's find out. Okay, let's find out. Misconception. So, a misconception, right? There are a lot of different ways to define these things, but this is a fine definition, I think. This is a type of false knowledge that you could have, right? In which an idea about the world conflicts with reality. And these are really important. I mean, some false knowledge is relatively innocuous, right? But some of these misconceptions are really pernicious because they affect the way that we interact and interpret the world around us, right? They can have profound implications for people's lives. These things are often well learned and integrated into knowledge, right? They're not isolated. And they're often firmly believed, right? These are things that people fluently retrieve and are very, very, very firmly believe in. Misconceptions can be about all kinds of things, right? Science, right? I'm particularly fond of misconceptions about psychology because I like to try to combat those things. That's what I care most about. But there are misconceptions about just about anything you could imagine, right? History, biology, physics. Here's an example of one, right? There's many people believe that the cause of the Earth's seasons is the fact that sometimes the Earth is closer to the sun and sometimes it's farther away. There's a great video called A Private Universe that shows Harvard graduates being asked this question immediately after graduation, and they all confidently stand up there and they go, well, duh, it's because the Earth moves closer to the sun and further away. Not true. Here's what it is. It's the tilt of the Earth on its axis, right? So a lot of people hold these misconceptions. Misconceptions can come in different flavors, right? So Mickey Chi's work is a set of work that I really like, and she kind of characterizes misconceptions that are occurring at different grain sizes, okay? We can think about misconceptions that occur at the ontological level, in terms of mental models, individual beliefs, right? So in terms of ontological categories, sometimes you have misconceptions where people have assigned some sort of phenomenon to the wrong ontological category. So for example, a lot of people think that heat is an entity. It's a thing that you can contain, right, and potentially touch. But heat is really a process. And if you don't understand that, right, that's going to be very problematic for you trying to understand how heat occurs, right? There are other things like electricity that fall into the same idea that you've misassigned things to a different ontological category than which they belong. Then you have things like mental models, right? So this might be something like how the seasons are caused, right? How the Earth revolves around the sun, or how the heart and the lungs oxygenate blood, right? And then you have individual beliefs, which is kind of the lowest level here maybe. And this could be things like Sydney is the capital of Australia. What's the capital of Australia? Canberra, good, right. A lot of people, right, will say Sydney. Very fluent. Okay, so one of the surprising things is, I think of these kind of different levels, the category level, the misassignment to a different ontological category is kind of a different situation. These ones are really, 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 really hard to correct, okay? Because you got to reassign things. Sometimes people don't even have the ontological category in their knowledge, right? Things like emergent processes are examples of that, right? But otherwise, with mental models and individual beliefs, one of the surprising things is that these things are actually pretty easy to correct. There's a number of different literatures that are not connected but are highly related that show that using the same basic method, this refutation method, you can correct these misconceptions really effectively. Here's a refutation method. What you do is you kind of elicit, right? You get the person to manifest the misconception, right? Or you describe it, and then you directly refute it and provide evidence to back up that refutation, and provide the correct information to help them revise their knowledge and undergo this process of conceptual change. And what you see is this refutation method across lots of different domains works with all these different types of misconceptions about mental models, individual beliefs. Here's an example of a laboratory study that does this with kind of more individual belief level misconceptions. What we did was we had people come in, we have them take a short answer test, right? So they get a bunch of general knowledge questions about science, These are things like, what's stored in a camel's hump? Water? No, it's fat. What's the driest place on Earth? Sahara Desert? No. Antarctica. Okay, so there are a bunch of general knowledge questions like this, right, that people give their response, and then we have them rate their confidence. And what you see is that a lot of times they produce incorrect information and do so in a highly confident manner, right? This is essentially what a misconception is, right? These are things that they firmly believe. And then we give them correct answer feedback afterwards. We bring them back later on for a short answer test, and we manipulated the timing of the test. Either we gave it immediately thereafter or 1 week later. And I should back up to say, what you usually see in all these studies that I just mentioned that show the efficacy of this refutation method is that they measure learning, when do you think? Right after you see conceptual change occur, right? Right after they get the refutation. And then what you see is what I'll show you here. People are quite good at correcting their misconceptions and revising their knowledge. So here what I'm plotting, this is a little complicated. I'm plotting the items for which people made errors, right? And these high confident errors are the ones that we could think about as misconceptions. And what you find is this counterintuitive thing. The more confident somebody was in their error, right, the more firmly they believed in it, the more likely they were later on to correct it. And that held both when we measured it immediately and a week later, right? You see this hypercorrection effect is what it's termed in the literature by Janet Metcalf and others, both immediately and after a week delay. One of the things you see there, though, is look at performance. It's going down a week later, right? Not as many correct responses after a week, right? Kind of decreasing. So what's going on there? Well, let's talk about that. What we looked at is you know, what's going on with their errors? Are these errors easily forgotten? Because if you look at the feedback literature, what a lot of theories would suggest is that revising your knowledge involves forgetting the false knowledge that you have, right? The errors that you've made. What was interesting here is we asked people to recall what they had said on the initial test, right? We said, okay, what's your answer on the final test? Okay, now think back. What did you say on the initial test? We want to see whether people could remember. Surprisingly, they can remember almost all of their errors. Maybe not all of them, but a vast majority of them, right? What was interesting is that the high confidence errors, right, that had been corrected, they were actually, when they made a high confidence error, corrected it, they were actually more likely to remember their initial error. So this suggests, right, that forgetting of errors is not actually necessarily what always happens. Sometimes people may maintain those two things in memory, right? They may say, oh, I used to think about it like this, but now I know it's like this, right? And actually having both those things and labeling them accordingly is important. Now, I referenced this decrease in performance, right? So what's going on there? Well, turns out students are starting to make more errors. And what are they? Well, they're their misconceptions coming back. Over the course of a week, a lot of times students forgot the correct answers, and they ended up reproducing that same misconception later on. So what this suggests is that errors may be easy to correct in the short run, but that correction, right, the durability of that correction is not necessarily particularly strong, right? These things may come back. Why is that? Well, this little distinction here, I think, helps to, this is a little jargony, but let me walk you through it. Helps to kind of help us think about that. So one of the things that you find in the learning literatures is this distinction between retrieval and storage strength, okay? Retrieval strength is basically an index of momentary accessibility of information, okay? Can you get to it right now? Storage strength is how well it is encoded into memory, right? Long-term memory. And retrieval strength can vary over time, right? It can dissipate. Storage strength pretty much stays constant, right? The more you practice something, the more you study it, greater increments of storage strength is going to stick around. Let me help you feel that, okay? I'm going to ask you a series of questions, answer them in your head, and I want you to feel, right? Pay attention to how it feels to retrieve these things. What's your name? That's good. You all awake? All right, good. You got that one? It's a tricky one. What was your kindergarten teacher's name? What did you eat for dinner last night? What were the 4 types of feedback that I mentioned earlier? So did those things feel a little bit different? Okay, so that first one, what was your name? What is your name? That should have come to mind fluently, right? Fluidly. Easy to access, quickly, right? This is something that you have practiced your whole life, right? High in storage strength. This is not something you're about to forget tomorrow. It's also high in retrieval strength, right? Very accessible. You're not about to lose access tomorrow, unless you have well, let's not go there. What was your kindergarten teacher's name? How many people got that? Some people did, okay. Other people, this is something, right, that you use for a year of your life. It is, in terms of storage strength, this is probably pretty high. If I told you that name or I gave you a hint, I bet you could get it. And then you'd have it for a while, right? The retrieval strength would be back, it'd be accessible. What did you eat for dinner last night, right? That should have been quick too. Just last night, right? Now, if I ask you a month from now, what did you eat on the night of, right? Are you going to be able to get it? Maybe if you eat the same thing for dinner every night. But if you don't, right, you're going to have a hard time getting back to that. That's something that is low in storage strength, right? Hasn't been encoded well into memory, but high in retrieval strength. And finally, what were the 4 types of feedback that I mentioned? Some people laughed. Well, this is probably something too that maybe is low in retrieval strength, low in storage strength, right? It might be hard to get to. You might not be able to get to it. The thing that we're dealing with here is that misconceptions are high in storage strength, high in retrieval strength, right? These are well-learned, densely connected within knowledge, and what we're trying to do is combat them with kind of a single exposure to something, right? May not be enough. Basically, what you have then is something that's low in storage strength, potentially high in retrieval strength, but that retrieval strength dissipates over time, which is why the misconception comes back over time. So what we wanted to do, and I'll kind of end with this, is to do a classroom study that looked at how would you build upon, capitalize upon the short-term ease of combating some of these misconceptions, right, to produce a more durable correction, right, more durable conceptual change. And what we did is, so this is in an introductory psychology course, we gave students a pre-course survey where we had them rate their belief in 20-odd common myths about psychology, okay? And these are things like the human mind is like a video recorder, or drinking alcohol kills brain cells. Doesn't kill brain cells. We can talk about that afterwards if you'd like. Feel free to drink alcohol. We gave them daily Mythbusters presentations, okay? And each presentation debunked a myth using the refutation method. So this was delivered by the instructor in class. Everybody got the presentations. And then we gave them online quizzes afterwards, where we gave them repeated retrieval practice on the correct information that refuted some of the myths, right? So for some of the myths, they got retrieval practice. For other myths, they didn't. Retrieval practice, I haven't really talked about this, but right, we've heard maybe a little bit about it at this conference. The idea of retrieving information from memory, we usually think about that as kind of a neutral event that doesn't affect memory or learning, but retrieving information from memory actually changes memory, and it can lead to better long-term retention, lead to deeper understanding. And so what we were interested in is whether doing this follow-up retrieval practice could help enhance the durability of that conceptual change that students had undergone, hopefully as a function of seeing this Mythbusters presentation. Finally, we gave them a post-course survey and had them re-rate their beliefs in all those myths, right? We also asked them, we gave them a knowledge assessment that asked them about the correct information that refuted the myths, right? Do you know, right? Here's a question, can you tell me the answer to this question? That should have been the correct information that refuted the myth, okay? So in contrast with the study I showed you earlier, here we're getting their belief and we're also getting, do they have the knowledge, okay? One final thing, which was this post-course survey, this is the beauty of doing classroom studies, either occurred 1 week after the course or 6 months after the course, okay? We're getting some educationally relevant timescales here. I could not hope to do that in a laboratory. Getting people to come back 6 months later is like, people laugh at me. So here's a slide for this Mythbusters presentation. this is like the header slide, and then each Mythbusters presentation had like actual content. But it went through the refutation method, right? And I don't know, I'm showing you pictures. So let me show you what happened on the post-course assessment. And what I'm going to do is focus in on items for which students had misconceptions. So these are items, myths for which they rated on that initial pre-course survey either a 5, 6, or 7 on a 7-point scale, right? So they're saying, I believe in this to varying extents. Here's what happened. This is the change in belief pre to post, right? Remember that everybody saw all the presentations, but for only half of the myths, right, did they get that repeated retrieval practice. Now, what's interesting is the presentations, right, very effective at reducing belief in these myths, which is great. The repeated retrieval practice didn't help very much. It didn't really add much to that change in belief, right? So that's interesting. When we assessed knowledge, we found kind of a different pattern. There we found that the Mythbusters presentation was effective, right, and helped them retain that knowledge. They retained more of it right after the semester and retained less over time. When we asked them 6 months later, the amount of correct information that they had retained decreased markedly. But on that knowledge assessment, what they could also do is reproduce that misconception. That was another possible response, just like before, right? And here is that data. So this is the proportion of misconceptions that they gave on that final knowledge assessment as a function of the retention interval, 1 week or 6 months. And what you can see is that with no further practice, these misconceptions tended to return over time, right? Some of them are still very much present 1 week later, but 1 week after the course, but then they come back even more 6 months later. The repeated retrieval practice was somewhat effective at reducing the amount of misconceptions that students held, but not nearly as much as we'd like it to be. So one of the things that I'm trying to explore now is how to ramp that up, right? How to make this intervention a bit more robust. And I'll tell you about that in a second. So just to recap, right? In the short run, it seems like lots of different misconceptions can be corrected relatively easily using this refutation method, which is, really has a lot of empirical support. However, the problem is that in education generally, and with this particularly, we oftentimes measure learning right after it occurs and say, done. We need to pay attention to the dynamics of what unfolds over time. And with respect to misconceptions, oftentimes they're going to come back if we don't do anything else. So one key, and this is what we were investigating in this follow-up study, was whether giving people retrieval practice in a different way might be more effective. And that is to give them practice applying their knowledge to different contexts, right? Introduce variability in addition to retrieval practice in order to help them really solidify their understanding of the correct information that refuted that misconception. And this is a new project that we've been doing. I don't have the data for you today because they're hot off the presses, but they look like this variable practice method really did increase the efficacy. There's also another aim of this project, which is that we created a set of videos and corresponding practice questions that combat popular myths about psychology. Here's some slides or snapshots from it, from a video. You can see that we branded it a little bit differently. Turns out there's this show called Mythbusters, right? Who knew? And I figured if I was going to start putting this stuff out there, I probably didn't want to get sued by them. So we went with Debunked. It's kind of like a riff on Punk, the show Punked. Anyway. And the idea behind these videos is not quite ready to set into the wild, but that these are going to be open access and free for anybody to use. So if anybody here teaches intro psych, talk to me. Joe, we need to talk. And these are effective, right? We've shown them to work in a course at University of Texas that had 1,500 undergraduates taking intro psych. And the goal is to create additional materials via crowdsourcing, right? So we used a method for making these videos that anybody can replicate. And the idea is to try to, take this refutation method, put it in the hands of people, generate new videos even about, other topics beyond psychology. So if anybody's interested in myth busting, come talk to me. I'd like to myth bust with you. So let me go back to the beginning here and just let's go through these pieces of conventional wisdom and wrap things up. So we thought about whether feedback should be given as soon as possible. And what we found was that delaying feedback can be beneficial. kind of contrary to belief, right? But sometimes immediate feedback is necessary, and that's fine, right? You could do either or here. But delaying feedback certainly is not bad. And you can kind of see what I'm doing here, right? There's a little meta, right, misconceptions that we have about, right? A little meta thing going on here. You catch on to that? Okay. Knowledge can prevent the acquisition of misconceptions, right? Well, so knowledge is not always protective, and we need to be aware, right? And what that research also speaks to is the role of feedback in helping people to prevent people from acquiring misconceptions when knowledge fails. And finally, this idea that misconceptions are extremely difficult to correct. Well, in the short run, maybe not. Except for, a few exceptions to that, but in the short run, it might be actually quite easy to correct them. The question is how to build upon that, right? And I think that there's a lot of research yet to be done on that. Okay, I'd like to finish by thanking my people, my students and collaborators, my funding. Thank you all for listening.